What if I told you that the best thing that ever happened to me was my biggest mistake? I know how that sounds. It sounds like a catchphrase, something we say after the dust has settled and the wounds have healed. But the truth is much cruder and much deeper. A mistake is not a detour on the path. Sometimes it is the path itself. Sometimes life needs to give us a violent push, throw us off a cliff that we have built ourselves, so that we finally stop looking at the map that others have drawn for us and start looking for our own compass, even if it is in shards on the ground. Today, I want to tell you the story of how a monumental failure broke my life to pieces, just to show me that I was putting together the wrong puzzle from the start. For many years, I believed that life was a climb, a steep, linear climb toward a peak called success, and I was a dedicated, almost fanatical climber. My inner compass was calibrated to what the world told me was north: promotions, recognition, financial security, the admiration, and perhaps the envy of others. My identity and my self-worth were completely tied to this ascension. I wasn't a person who had a job. I was my job. This obsession was not born out of nowhere. It was forged in fear. The fear of being common, of being forgotten, of not being enough. I carried within me the ghost of instability, a cellular memory of more difficult times that made me believe that the only way to be safe was to always be rising, always accumulating, always proving my worth. Security, for me, was not a state of being. It was a prize that was won at the top of the mountain, and I was willing to pay any price to get there. My routine was a testament to that mentality. The alarm rang at 5 a.m, a shrill sound that cut through the darkness and began the daily battle. Before the sun even thought of rising, I was already in front of the laptop, with a cup of bitter coffee, trying to beat the day before it started. I saw sleep as an enemy, a waste of precious time that my competitors were certainly using to overtake me. Lunch was a sandwich swallowed in 10 minutes on the keyboard, eyes fixed on the screen, so as not to miss a beat. My body was just a vehicle for my brain, and I fueled it with caffeine and adrenaline, ignoring all their protests. I prided myself on being the first to arrive and the last to leave the office. I remember the feeling of being on the 15th floor, late at night, watching the city. Lights come on below. I didn't see people in their homes, living their lives. I saw a scoreboard, and every light on in another office building was a competitor I was beating. It was a lonely and yet intoxicating feeling. I was in control. I was in charge. At least that's what I thought. The human cost of this climb was very high, and I paid it in daily installments. I remember a phone call from my best friend. She was overjoyed, telling her that she had finally gotten engaged, as she described. The magical moment, I was responding to an urgent email, typing with one hand and holding the phone with the other. I said, "Yuhum, how incredible. Congratulations." But my mind was 1,000 miles away. At the end of the call, she paused and said in a slightly smaller voice, "You look busy. We'll talk later." That after has become increasingly rare. I was trading real connections for abstract achievements, and I didn't even realize the emotional bankruptcy that was setting in. The climb that would lead me to my big mistake began like all the others, with an opportunity I couldn't refuse. A high-visibility project, a golden chance to prove my worth and secure the next big promotion. It was my personal Everest. The deadline was almost impossible, resources were limited, and the pressure was immense. For the me of that time, this scenario was not frightening, it was stimulating. It was the perfect arena for me to demonstrate my strength, my resilience, my ability to make the impossible happen. I saw that project not as a job, but as the final stage for my consecration. I assembled my team and drew up an aggressive plan. From the beginning, the project required us to navigate a fine line between ambition and integrity. There were shortcuts we could take, small simplifications that could speed up the process but compromised quality in the long run. At first, I resisted them. My reputation was built on excellence after all, but as time passed and the pressure increased, the voice of prudence began to be drowned out by the voice of urgency. I remember the exact moment when the compass broke. The scene is etched in my memory in slow motion. We were in a planning meeting, in the glass room on the 15th floor, 2 weeks before the deadline. The air was heavy with fatigue and the smell of reheated coffee. A member of my team, Daniel, a brilliant engineer whom I deeply respected for his calmness and wisdom, asked for the floor. He stood up, walked over to the whiteboard, and with eerie clarity drew the flow of the system. He pointed to a specific point, a central node in the architecture, and said, in a firm voice, "Here. The database we are using will not support the volume of requests we projected. At launch, with few users, it will work. But in a week, maybe 2, with actual use, we'll have a cascading failure. It's like building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. The whole system will stop. The silence in the room was palpable. I felt a chill down my spine, because deep down in my being I knew he was right. It was the same worry that my own intuition had been whispering to me for days, a flea behind the ear that I chose to ignore. The solution he proposed was logical but painful. We would have to stop, redesign that part of the architecture, and redo a significant portion of the work. That would mean admitting a delay of at least 1 month. It would mean calling the client, the director, and saying that we would not meet promised deadline. It would mean, in my mind as a mountaineer, failure. It would mean admitting that I, the results machine, had planned badly. At that moment, I had a choice. On the one hand, the hard truth, the long way, the act of integrity. On the other, the shortcut, the bet, the performance. I looked at Daniel, saw the honest conviction in his eyes, and felt my own soul giving me a nudge. And then my mind started racing in a torrent of panic and rationalization. He's right. I know he's right, but if I admit it now, that meeting with the vice president next week, the schedule I promised, they will see me as weak, as someone who can't handle the pressure. The promotion goes to Ricardo for sure. No, I can't let that happen. It's just a risk. Maybe it won't happen. We'll fix it later. The important thing is to win now. This internal battle lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The voice of fear won. I made my decision. I forced a reassuring smile, stood up, and with a confidence I didn't feel, said, "Daniel, I appreciate your concern and detailed analysis. That's why you're so valuable to this team. However, I believe that the risk is controllable. We can optimize the system with some palliative adjustments and reinforce the structure after launch in phase 2. We cannot in any way afford to delay now." At that moment, I didn't just ignore a colleague, I ignored myself. I betrayed my team and my own intuition. I traded wisdom for speed, made my mistake. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice born of fear. The next 2 weeks were a frantic race against the truth. We made up the problems, created temporary solutions to hide the cracks in the foundation, and focused all our energy on preparing a launch presentation that was flawless. And it was. On the day of the presentation to the board and the client, everything went perfectly. The performance was a success. There was applause, handshakes, congratulatory emails. The promotion I longed for was all but guaranteed. That night, I celebrated my victory with a glass of expensive wine, pushing to the back of my mind the nagging feeling that my castle was made of cards, built on quicksand. The fall did not take long, and it was much faster than the climb. A week after the launch, the first cracks began to appear. Small bugs, isolated customer complaints, things we try to minimize as adaptation problems. But the shaky foundation that Daniel had laid could not be contained for long. On a Monday morning, 10 days after the launch, the system collapsed. It was not a subtle mistake. It was a catastrophic, public, and humiliating failure. The project that would be my greatest triumph became my greatest disaster. The period that followed was the darkest of my professional life. I was called into emergency meeting, where I had to face the disappointed looks of my leaders and the justified anger of the client. I had to look at my team, who had trusted me, and admit that I had led them in the wrong direction. Daniel never said, "I told you so," but his silence was more deafening than any accusation. The trust that took me years to build evaporated in a matter of days. The promotion, of course, disappeared, and I was left alone in the midst of the rubble of my own mistake. The first reaction was denial and the search for culprit. The pressure was too much. No one gave me enough resources. The problem was more complex than it seemed. But in the silence of my apartment at night, when there was no one else to lie to, the truth was undeniable. The mistake was mine. My blind ambition, my fear of appearing weak, my choice to ignore the truth in favor of expedience. Shame was a physical presence, a weight in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I felt like a fraud. The image of the competent and infallible professional that I had built with so much effort had been shattered, and what was left was someone I barely recognized. Fallible, frightened, and deeply lost person. The peak of the mountain I was climbing turned out to be a cliff, and I had just fallen off it. At that moment, at rock bottom, I genuinely believed it was the end. The end of my career, my reputation, my identity. I had no idea that it was actually the beginning of everything. Rock bottom is a strange place. It's terrifying, lonely, and dark, but it's also surprisingly solid. When you lose everything you thought defined you, your reputation, your status, your trajectory of success, there's nowhere else to fall. You are forced to stop. And in the deafening silence that followed my professional disaster, the noise of my ambition finally fell silent, and for the first time in years, I could hear it. What I heard at first was the torturous voice of repentance, echoing in the void I had created myself. The days following the collapse of the project were a blur of shame. I locked myself in the house, avoiding phone calls, ignoring messages. The simple act of going to the bakery seemed like a Herculean task, as if everyone knew about my failure, as if the word fraud was stamped on my forehead. The apartment, once a refuge from the outside world, became a mental torture chamber. I replayed the meeting with Daniel in an infinite loop in my mind, dissecting every word, every choice, every micro-expression on the faces of my colleagues. The torture was not in the mistake itself, but in the clarity that it had been a conscious choice. I had seen the truth, and out of fear, I turned my back on it. My ego, the persona of the infallible climber I had so painstakingly constructed, was in ruins, and the pain of that loss was excruciating. That identity was all I knew. Without her, who was I? I was no longer the brilliant professional, the future director, the woman that everyone admired. I was just the person who made the mistake that cost the company millions and broke the trust of their team. In this void, the only thing left was raw pain, stripped of any justification. My body felt the weight of this shame. I barely slept, and when I did, I woke up with my heart racing, reliving the moment of the fall. I remained in this limbo for weeks. The company and I agreed to my departure, a formality for what was already a reality. I remember the day I went to the office to sign the papers and return my badge. The building that once represented power and achievement now looked like a monument to my failure. Walking through those corridors, avoiding people's gazes, was one of the most difficult acts of my life. As I handed over the small plastic rectangle that gave me access to that world, I felt as if I was giving away my own identity. I went out into the street in the middle of the afternoon, unemployed, disoriented, and completely naked of everything I thought defined me. In an act of desperation and loneliness, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I asked for help. I called that same friend whose engagement I had barely registered, the person I had consistently put on the back burner in favor of my work. When she answered, my voice was a thread. I couldn't articulate anything other than an "I need to talk." 20 minutes later, she was at my door. I prepared myself for the judgment, for the "I told you so," for the talk about how I had lost myself. Instead, as I cried and told the humiliating story, she just listened to me. She offered no solutions, did not try to minimize my pain, did not say that everything would be fine. She just stood there, present, witnessing my pain. When I finally stopped, exhausted, she looked at me with a compassion that dismantled me and said something simple, but that changed everything. "Welcome back. I missed you." I didn't understand. "Back from where?" I asked. And she replied, "Back to Earth. To the club of human beings, you know, those who make mistakes, who fail, who sometimes make the wrong choice out of fear. I missed that person, not the perfect machine you were trying to be." Those words were the first glimmer of light. The idea that my mistake didn't make me a monster, but simply human. The possibility that failure was not a sentence of exclusion, but a rite of passage to a more authentic way of existing. It was not a forgiveness that came from the outside, but a permission that I began to give myself from within. The permission to be imperfect, with shame beginning to give way to a timid curiosity. The question in my head began to change. It went from being, "How could I be so stupid?" to becoming, "What made me make that choice?" This new question set me on a path of archaeological excavation of my own soul. I needed to understand the architecture of my mistake. I started writing. No goal, no structure, just pages and pages of thoughts, fears, memories. And when he saw the words on the paper, the patterns began to emerge. I clearly saw my hunger for external validation, an almost childlike need to receive a congratulations from authority figure. I saw how my fear of financial instability made me averse to any risk that might delay my ascension, even if the greater risk was that of losing my integrity. That's when I understood the truth about my compass. I thought it was just out of calibration, pointing to a north of external success. The truth was deeper. The needle of my compass was not magnetic. She was not looking for a true north. It was made of a metal that simply reacted to the nearest and strongest magnet. My boss's opinion, my family's expectations, market trends. My compass did not guide me. She just reacted. And that's why at the moment of the big decision, when my intuition, my true north, whispered one thing, and the fear of disapproval, the external magnet, screamed another, I followed the cry. The mistake was not the problem. The mistake was the inevitable symptom of a much deeper illness, total disconnection from myself. The life I was building was not mine. It was a brilliant performance to a standing ovation, but it was a role that was killing me inside. The collapse of the project was not a tragedy. It was an intervention. It was life, in its sometimes brutal wisdom, telling me, this path ends here. You can't continue in that direction anymore. From this perception, the path back began to be drawn. But it wasn't a way back to the career I had, or the person I was. It was a way back home, to my essence, which meant in practice rebuilding my compass, this time from scratch. My first step was silence. I, who filled every second with noise and productivity, forced myself to be quiet. I took long walks in nature, without a cell phone, without music. At first, the silence was filled with the echo of my failures. But gradually, a new voice began to emerge. A calmer, wiser voice. The voice of intuition that I had silenced for so long. I began to ask myself things that I had never allowed myself to ask before. Not what do I want to achieve, but who do I want to be? Not how can I impress others, but what brings me a sense of true peace? Not what's the next rung of the ladder, but is this ladder resting on the right wall? The answers did not come like lightning, but like a slow dawn. I realized that what I really valued wasn't the titles or the status, but the creativity, the deep connection with people, the feeling of doing a job that had a real purpose, no matter how small. I realized that my strength was not in my ability to be ruthless, but in my courage to be vulnerable. The right path that my mistake showed me was not a new career or a 5-step plan for success. It was a set of new principles for navigating life: integrity over speed, authenticity over approval, purpose over prestige, presence over productivity. I began to apply these principles in small things. I resumed contact with friends I had neglected. I enrolled in a pottery class, an old dream that I had always judged unproductive. I began to say no to opportunities that, while they looked good on paper, smacked of old empty ambition. Every little choice was an act of calibrating my new compass. I was learning to trust myself again. Of course, the fear has not disappeared. When I started looking for work again, the temptation to go back to the old character was immense, but something had changed. I went to the interviews not to prove my worth, but to find out if there was an alignment of value. In an interview for a high-level position, the director asked me about my biggest failure. The old me would have invented a rehearsed response, turning a small flaw into a false lesson in strength. But the new me took a deep breath and told the truth. I told the story of the project, of my wrong choice, of the fall. And I ended by saying, that mistake was the most important event of my career, because it taught me that success without integrity is the worst kind of failure. I didn't get that job, but I left that room lighter than ever. Because, for the first time, I wasn't performing. I was being myself. And the feeling of being at peace with my own history, with my flaws and everything, was more valuable than any position. Error was not an obstacle in my way. It was the signpost that forced me off the wrong road, that fast highway efficient that was taking me to a place where my soul didn't want to be. The real tragedy is not to fall. It is not to make a mistake. The real tragedy is to keep running in the direction that empties us, ignoring all the signs, until there is nothing left of us to save. My biggest mistake gave me my biggest gift. It gave me back to myself. He taught me that success is not how high you climb, but how aligned you walk. And that the right path often only reveals itself to us when we have the courage to admit that we are completely lost. Today, I invite you to look at your own story with a little more compassion. Think of a mistake or failure from your past that still weighs on you. For a moment, try to take the weight off judgment and shame, and just ask, what did this experience, as painful as it was, try to teach me about my true path? What part of me was she inviting me to meet? If this reflection helped you to look at your own journey in a different way, with more kindness, subscribe and leave your like. It's a way for us to keep these conversations about the imperfect beauty of being human always alive here.